education brief is not something that is widespread here in the States in terms of working on that specifically for the goal of a building. So that's some of what my role is, trying to fill that gap, is that's not a norm that schools know to do before doing a design project.
Yeah, that educational brief has become a very important document, I think, anywhere. That's a lot of your role is actually filling that stuff in, Rachel. And Anna Sala-Avida is another example. She was doing a PhD with quite a while, South Australia. She's called an educational space planner. In terms of, she's an architect, but works in that in-between space between the architects and the educators. And I think all of this, the conversation is good, because this conversation is about the fact, have we actually peaked in our designs? Have we gone about as far as we can go with innovation and flexibility? And the reason why I say that is because if you look back through the last 10 years of development, they've been the two key words that have come up time and time again. Almost everything you read in terms of, grants for research in this field or articles that people write, nearly always try to put it into the context of an innovative learning environment, and their descriptions of that frequently are the same, and that is that they're a flexible, highly adaptive set of spaces designed to be develop student-centered learning, etc. And any of us could just reel off that line of conversation. And so my rather contentious thing, and I'm doing this for recording now, so I forgot to hit it at the very start, but my provocation is that I think we've gone about as far as we can go with that mantra of innovation and flexibility. And it is time for us to look at what we've learned and what we've got through our evidence of our research and our practices, in order to be able to say, well, okay, what is next? What is the next sort of thing we're moving to? Where's this heading us? Having said that, it's not like we are driving the change. I suppose part of what I'm thinking is the evidence from ILETC, the project before, and what's coming through in ILESE is the fact that we are, as a group of designers and educators, we are changing, we are moving things forward. What is lacking, I think, is us realising where we're going. We don't quite understand what it is we're doing. So the whole idea of these cafe sessions is to throw out ideas and have people discuss and think. And so that's my position. So just to begin with, I'll start by saying that the notion of flexibility is one that is so ingrained, it's a baseline, that designers are producing absolutely fantastic buildings, and that flexibility of spaces, of walls that move, the furniture that is highly adaptive, that is now set there as being actually, that's the basic of what we want to do. Most new buildings now have elements of what we would call ILEs built into them. There's very few traditional spaces now being designed and built. And the other part of that, of course, is the practices. The teachers are increasingly realising that actually these spaces can adapt and help them to move their pedagogies forward. Yes, there are still teachers who teach in the traditional way, and I think that that's actually a good thing for our field. There is no one solution, and there's certainly no one approach to teaching. You have some teachers who teach best and some kids who learn best in a traditional sort of setting, in a traditional sort of pedagogic approach. The same as you've got some kids who absolutely thrive in a much more open and adaptive environment. So we'll always have those things, they'll always be there. But I think what's actually happening at the moment is we're getting much more sophisticated in how we're thinking of those spaces actually exist and how they work together. So, Michaela, I'm interested in the Christchurch, New Zealand situation. Do you think there's any truth in what I'm saying, or I'm just blowing hot air?
No, I agree. I was thinking when we first built the new schools, we didn't have the education brief, and we kind of oh, here's Greg. Great, he's hello, Greg, another New Zealander. So he's one of our navigators that work with the schools to create the education brief. So initially, the schools that the ministry built straight away after earthquakes were quite big, and they were referred to as barns. And then the more later version are more flexible and having some single cell, possibly single cell, or at least a wall that can be moved back, or sliding doors. So it felt like we'd sort of swung back a little bit. But the latest things I'm reading in the education brief that I hadn't seen before is culturally responsive, flexible spaces. So for different cultures, perhaps, or different different ways of using the building. And something that I've read last week that just sort of hit me in the head, it was so obvious, but we promoted the use of unisex toilets, so standalone cubicles, so to really address the gender diversity that we have in our schools now. But some research that we were doing with some Muslim families is that some Muslim children won't use those toilets because they don't feel safe, and you think, oh, it should have been and instead of sometimes there's a swing, isn't
particularly
there?
the girls won't go to them either.
Right. Which is a big issue. It's a big issue, but yeah,
well, that's right. There is actually, because some kids are holding on all day.
Yeah, poor things. And I must admit, we used to do that as well when I was a kid because of the bullying. If you went to the toilet, you were prone to set yourself up bullying. So we used to hold on all day. So there's another issue of toilets. And that's actually a good example of the sort of way I think this conversation might go this hour. But, just to go back a step, though, and say, this notion of innovation and flexibility, I was just saying, Greg, that my take on this is that actually we've arrived there. We've got that. It's happening automatically now, both in the way we're designing and also in the way teachers are starting to use these spaces. We did a large survey with the ILETC project of Australian and New Zealand teachers, and it was about 1,200 teachers responded. So it was a big survey. The question there was, how are you moving into these spaces? Does it take you very long? What have you taught in? How long does it take you to move in? What are your favourite spaces? Those sorts of questions. And that really turned on its head our notion that actually teachers aren't adaptive, that teachers are still teaching the traditional way, which used to be the conversation that was very, very common. We build these lovely flexible spaces and teachers are still teaching in their old way. We've got to somehow get them to teach more fluidly and more in line with student-centred approaches. And yet this survey showed that the majority of teachers moving into these spaces were actually doing that. And surprisingly, the majority of teachers were saying it takes them about 6 months to adapt to an innovative learning environment. And that sort of backed up other evidence we found through the project. Rachel's PhD is an example of this, where you did have those examples of teachers who were sticking to the traditional way, but the majority of them were actually moving in and starting to use these spaces and explore them. Rachel used the term the buzz, that they were seeking the buzz. And the buzz comes from students engaging well in their learning, but part of that, of course, is engaging well in their learning because of the spaces they're working in. Rachel, your thoughts on this? Do you think, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, you're balancing two children, but what do you think about my rather silly comment that we peaked, that we've gone about as far as we can go with these innovative spaces, and while we can adapt and change and keep refining, it's actually all pretty well baseline now?
I think all the parts and pieces, we almost have like a menu that's pretty standard that schools can select and choose between in terms of the spaces themselves or kind of features of the space. So do you want glass walls? Do you want operable partitions? There's kind of a menu, right?
Yeah.
And I see schools selecting different levels of depth, but where I see us needing to go more in the US is we have a lot of them asking questions about still not feeling satisfied by if they're worth it or not, and seeing that the cons may outweigh the pros. So in terms of, we're doing more post-occupancy evaluations of these schools to really show that the pros outweigh the cons, which doesn't necessarily get into kind of which of the pieces and specific parts of how they should go together, but does help, I guess, them feel more confident in it, because that's where we kind of see people implementing them in different ways. So I would say like the menu is set, and like maybe we've gone as far as we can in terms of what are the parts and pieces, but I think a lot of school districts have various comfort levels of like selecting the more innovative options, right? There's still a lot of hesitancy there. So in terms of design, maybe implementation, I don't know if the US is as far as, and we were definitely not as far along as where New Zealand and Australia are. So we kind of, I always look to y'all to see, what's next.
I think that's a very important distinction, because that'd be the second half of what I'd put forward for this short cafe. The first part is that our designs are peaked. What we do now is just refining. but we've got the same basic structure, and that notion of flexibility and innovation is standard now. It's a set there. And it's a little bit like what you're just saying then, Rachel. And the second half is in line, I think, with with what you're alluding to with your comments, Rachel, about now working with the teachers. Michaela, you've talked about it in terms of your educational briefs and where they're sort of pushing you. And Greg, I see you nodding as well. The second half of it is we are now moving, whether we realise it or not, into a much more sophisticated approach to learning environments that actually looks at the experiences of the students within the spaces. The spaces themselves are now set. And yes, actually designers are still coming up with fantastic innovations. Every building I see, I think, oh, wow, look at that. But the reality is those basic principles are there. They were set a few years ago and they've been refined. We've got to the stage where we are moving ahead, but that's not actually the big movement anymore. Like I say, that's the baseline. What is happening is more and more designers and educators are looking at not just teachers and how teachers are using the spaces, but actually increasingly, and you gave it away a second ago, Michaela, with your notion of cultural sensitivities. We're looking at what are the experiences of these kids actually in these spaces? I don't know, what would you say to that comment?
Yeah, I'd probably reinforce that. I think we've solved lots of the physical things. Like, acoustics are solved, heating's solved, those sorts of things are solved. The bit we haven't solved are the human elements. And I still don't think we have necessarily, there are so many solutions to the pedagogical issues. Like one of the things that really struck home to me on a visit to some schools in Melbourne, PPP schools, like the public-private partnership schools, same footprint, same furniture, same floor tiles on the floor being used in fundamentally different ways pedagogically that were both highly successful. And that was a really interesting thing to learn, that while there may be a bit of almost a checkbox of, like Rachel was talking about, you can have this or this, you can have these kinds of sliding doors, but people get really hung up on what kind of tables you're going to use or what colour you're going to paint stuff. And I think the education brief process going, what is the kind of education you're trying to make the intentional and unavoidable consequences, the phrase that I use, of being in the space. And if you've got that nailed down, at least refined a little bit maybe, rather than nailed down in the education brief, then you get out of the way, let the architects, the smart people design the space to do that for you. And to me, that's what our brief process is trying to do. But one of the things that, I don't think it's overselling it, concerns me that I still see quite a bit of, is people moving into spaces without having really done, like there's a group of people who have done the thinking and the designs there, and suddenly it's built, and then the teachers start thinking about how they're going to use it, when they could have spent quite a bit of time prototyping and hit the ground running. So I think it would be an interesting thing to do, to track almost the student outcomes. And I'm not just thinking about achievement, but the well-being and engagement and all those sorts of things, as they move into spaces well prepared versus we've cut a ribbon and moved in on the first day of term 3, and when the teachers have just packed up and moved boxes from single cell spaces into an open space, and now they're going to try and figure it out. And what happens to the outcomes for the next 2 terms, 5 terms?
So with our Grow Otago project, and Greg is a navigator who works in the more Otago, like further south than where we are, so not quite Grow Otago, but with the navigators who help with create the brief, which does include the cultural responsiveness and the cultural narrative, which is the other side of it I'll come back to. But the navigators spend about 8 months on a good day. Sometimes we have to do it faster, but on a good day to a full brief, 8 months. But then the navigators attached to the school 18 months post occupancy to help with supporting the teachers to deliver the new ways of working. Because like Greg said, you move in, you put your art boxes away, and it's the honeymoon period for the first term usually. It's quite exciting and everyone's happy. But 6 months later, a year later, sometimes some wheels fall off and there's some tension, or people come and go, because it's all about the relationships between that teaching pair or teaching 3 or teaching 4, and one person comes and goes, it rocks the boat. And so having really strong mates agreement, so mutually agreed teacher expectations, I forget what they're called, but all that prototyping that Greg mentioned, that should be happening during the master planning stage. So that's what the navigators try to push in the school, whilst the school's master planning and doing the designing, which can take a year or 2 years, there should be prototyping and there should be trial and error. And sometimes we've set up classrooms that we know that are going to be demolished, or do a classroom first and then different subjects or different year groups go in and prototype for a couple of terms and see what works or doesn't work. But it's all about the teacher, you know, and the relationships. Because I think in the past with single cell, if your child had a bad year at school, you'd blame the teacher. But now it's the space. But really, it was all about the teaching. It was all about the relationships and the processes that happen within the space. But if I just go back to the innovations, and you talked about designs, and Rachel, you said about the menu, we've started to go to that as well. So we do have the bespoke education brief, especially for a big build, but sometimes if it's a 2 classroom, 4 classroom role growth build, then the school might be just working from, and I call it the Happy Meal menu, right, which no one in property likes, but that is basically what it is. Sliding doors are worth so many points.
Yeah.
Windows, verandas, breakout spaces, and there's so many points to work with. But I do have a scaled down education brief for that, because even though you're limited in your range of design choice, you can still outfit it to match the cultural narrative. So there's a cultural narrative written for each space or each area of land. Well, there should be. If there's not one, then we pay for one to be done. And then the furnishings and the way it's set out and the placement and everything, it should align with the cultural narrative of the place.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's some things you just said then that strike a bell for me. You know, and in some ways it's reflected in the projects that the group that I work with in Melbourne have gone through. You know, we've been doing quite large Australian Research Council grants for more than a decade now. The first 2 are about the design. So there's the Happy Meal stuff, there's the spaces. And we moved from that into evaluation. We did a large project over about 3 years on how do we actually work out whether these spaces are having the effect we want them to have. And even though that project's finished, the work in it is still going. We're about to release a book in January about school-led valuation of learning spaces. And then we went into the very big ILETC project, which for 4 years focused on teachers, you know, and the sort of conversation you're giving us there at the moment, Michaela, around that. And I think, though, that while the conversation into the future is going to be about teachers in these spaces, that notion of the teachers is not about how the teachers fit into the spaces and how they use them, improve their pedagogy. I think in Australia and other places I've visited and had a look at, you're getting these subtle hints that teachers are now saying, actually, what about the students themselves? You know, okay, I might teach this way and the spaces might be like that. Some of us change, some of us don't, etc. Let's just say we know that. But now what we don't understand, what is it like for John or Mary or Henry or Fred to come into these spaces and live a day in the spaces and engage with the way the teachers are teaching and engage with the spaces that exist. But the reality is what that child works out at the end of the day with is totally independent. It's just about them and all of the nuances around their life and what impacts their lives, whether they come from a poor background, rich background, whether they are artistic or scientific or whatever. And that's what we don't understand. We don't understand that sort of one-to-one relationship between the child and the space that we provided for them. And you've talked about the cultural sensitivities, and that's one really good example. I think, you know, that, Greg, you talked about learning outcomes, for instance, and that's another, because most kids want to do okay or have academic sort of goals, I suppose, to some degree. There's also that whole notion of the wellbeing engagement, you know, to what degree are these spaces creating an environment where kids actually flourish, you know, where they feel safe and their wellbeing is being looked after. And the third component we're talking about now is that student engagement with the spaces is about also about that notion of inclusivity. And it's not just, you know, kids with disabilities coming in and being able to get the most from their experiences within their school. It's also to do, obviously, with that huge range of disabilities in terms of neurological disorders or behavioural disorders or learning disorders or hearing problems or vision issues, etc., etc. How are our spaces responding to that? And it's surprising. We did a lit review a while back for a chapter we were writing, and there was almost nothing written on that aspect. So to us, that's the new barrier. That's the new barrier, the stuff we don't know, but it's also the new vision of where we're heading. We're becoming much more sophisticated in our designs of the spaces to the stage which is normal, I think. And we're becoming much more knowledgeable about how teachers are using the spaces. But the part we don't understand is the kids. So I've just waxed lyrical there. What do you guys think about that?
Well, it's one of the chief criticisms of, what we call the sort of modern learning environment, whatever your term is that catering to the kids at the edges, isn't it? The neurodiverse kids, the kids with behavioural or concentration issues, whatever it happens to be. So but I think that often comes down to a human component again, like it's a pedagogical thing. What kind of furniture you have or any of those sorts of things doesn't actually make much difference. I think often these spaces where you're collaborating amplify practice. Like if your behaviour management is a bit dodgy, man, you're going to get found out when there's 4 of you. But if you've got good relationships with kids, good behaviour management, you run a good, tight ship, then you're probably going to transfer relatively easily to a different way of working. I think it's about that fluency of practice that really matters, and that's why. I circle back to the being prepared. Having thought it through and figured out how you're going to work in the space is really, really critical. I think there's almost some moral and ethical things we need to think about around, like, experimenting with kids. Is it okay for, how long is okay for teachers to have time and space to figure it out? I don't think we've really grappled with that. Yeah.
They refer to it as a sandpit. We have a sandpit term, or a sandpit year, or play in the sandpit. I don't think that's good enough. If you've got a child in that classroom where your teachers are playing in the sandpit for a year, I don't think so. But I think anecdotally, I think there's a lot of parents who aren't happy with large spaces in their child. They feel like their child's lost, not being closely monitored enough in all sorts of areas. All these children that can just go under the radar, and they're very good at it. They're not at either end. They're sort of those beige kids in the middle, and they just go under the radar of everyone. And really, they've got a lot of potential there that needs to be unlocked if they just had more time. So that parents aren't happy. Like you can see on the community Facebooks I'm in all the time, people say they're getting lost, they're not learning, blah, blah, blah. And what school has smaller classrooms? And in Christchurch, it's like, well, there aren't any.
Now it's interesting that Rachel's bringing a couple of points through in the in the chat room, saying that what we talk about now is a big concern in the United States as well. And she makes the comment that probably about 95% of the time teachers and schools just dive in, and a fair whack of the time it doesn't work. So that notion of planning, of the educational brief, of the co-design, the prototyping, bringing people on board, getting them to use it. I see that, and I think that we are lucky in Australia and New Zealand that just through perhaps serendipity, we happen to have sort of really moved ahead quickly for a number of reasons. We know even so, if Australia, and Rachel says that, she looks at Australia and New Zealand as an example. I mean, even with the quick movements that Australia and New Zealand have done, we still only have about a quarter of our spaces as what we'd probably call a more flexible learning environment. So we've still got a long way to go in terms of building them. But having said that, the new buildings coming out nearly all have some flexibility and innovation to them. So I think that the whole world has got a long way to go still. And, certainly, Rachel, in the United States, the United States has got a really diverse sort of set of issues to do with education because of the way they fund it. Whereas in Australia and New Zealand, the governments put a huge amount of money into education. And in the United States, it's much more community focused, the funding. And that makes a difference. How much money does your community actually have? designates then the quality of the spaces that kids are working within. In Europe, it's interesting because you've got a lot of advances happening, and yet, even though you could throw a blanket across Europe, the reality is they still work largely independently. I just came back from a talk in Turkey with European SchoolNet. We're running a session there, and one of the comments they made about the work we're doing here that I was presenting on was the fact that we're building evidence. And one of the problems in Europe is while you've got groups who are doing some beautiful research, what's driving these spaces isn't necessarily evidence-based. So we've got a huge range of problems in terms of where we go next. So I'm not saying we've achieved something and we move to the next level, because a lot of places are still around the edges, still not doing it. But, I think, Rachel, do you want to make any comment on, you're sitting quietly balancing kids on each knees and looking after a sick husband, but you're also listening. Just let us know if you want to actually make a comment on something.
And this is just really validating what we're trying to build within my firm, because we're specifically trying to fill this gap. So it's just, this has been very beneficial for me to kind of remind myself of why we're doing this, because I think it's just, we struggle. There's so many systemic barriers in the States for people don't realize that they need to prepare for it. They just don't. And they don't realize it until they're already in the spaces 2 years in. And then they just kind of, you'll talk to some people and they'll say, yeah, I could see these spaces being beneficial. We're just not ready for them. And others just that are a little bit more cynical, just saying the spaces are awful. What were the architects thinking? And it's just really hard to get folks to, because they have to spend money to, whether that be money in terms of their time for teachers to prepare, or money in terms of a consultant like us to come in and help them. And so that's, people just don't realize that it's a need.
Yeah.
And I think that's the hardest part, is how do we let them know that if they're going to spend the money on these facilities, it is very crucial if they want to really reach their goals and do something different than just the traditional model, that they need to invest the time to make it work.
Yeah, and having the evidence to support that is one of the important things as well. It's so often teachers I know will improve and change their practices as evidence that what they're moving towards actually works. That's a fairly strong characteristic. And yet it's not easy doing evidence-based work around learning environments, because it's a very slippery concept. As you said a minute ago, Greg, you can have two places that are designed exactly the same and that are used totally differently, one place to the other. So, I think our goals in front, because this is a largely forward-focusing little session. And I think one of the characteristics coming out of this conversation is some agreement on the fact that actually we're going much wider now than just the design of spaces. We're going much more into, Greg, you were saying, teachers thinking about, well, how am I using it? What am I doing here? And Michaela, you're talking about the sort of things that Grow Heart are putting into place through the educational brief and many other strategies I know, to try to get teachers to engage with those spaces and rethink teaching. But I suppose, we're drawing sort of towards an end of the conversation. I'd be saying, for me, the question rather than is with a teacher, rather than saying how am I using the spaces, I think the way we're going at the moment, the comment is going to be teachers saying how are my kids using the spaces is actually going to be the focus of work we've got coming up, because we'll never get a total solution to anything in education. You've always got outliers and you've always got percentages that won't go ahead. But as a body of people, we are moving ahead. We're teaching better now than what we did 100 years ago. Our spaces are better than what they were 50 years ago. We are continuing to grow. And to me, the next area of growth is going to be us becoming much more cognizant of the real life experiences of all kids. Yeah, I agree, the middle ones, as well as the ones on the edges, the ones with disabilities, the ones who are thriving, their experiences in these spaces. And how is the design, meeting that? And does it need further refinement to do that? How are our practices helping kids to make the most of these spaces? And for educators in terms of policy, etc., are we putting into place the steps we need to get the next 25% of spaces working even better? These are sort of big challenges that we've got in front of us. So perhaps just to sort of to wind things up a little bit, I'd love to hear from you guys an answer to this question, and that is that if you look ahead at the work that you're doing at the moment, Rachel, your work is a bit different to what Michaela and Greg's is in New Zealand, what mine is in Australia. We're doing slightly different things. But for all of us, what would be the claim we would make about the next 5 years of work we do? You know, you think ahead and say, right, the next 5 years I'm doing this, this, and this. At the end of that time, what I want to be able to say is what we found was we found this. You know, we developed that, we came up with that. What would be that claim? What would be that thing that would really make you think your 5 years was well spent?
I think it's probably trying to make sense of things. Sorry, Michaela. The joys of lag on Zoom. Trying to make sense of things. Like, I think part of the job of those of us in facilitation or navigation or whatever brings us to working with the schools is helping them to make sense of all the disparate things. Because there's lots of agendas in this space. There are people who passionately hate them. There are people who passionately love them. There are people trying to sell things into education because it's a bit of a, you know, schools pay their bills as opposed to other people. So the furniture manufacturers and, you know, just have some of these and it'll be awesome. So getting some advice and support from people who aren't necessarily trying to sell you something, who have that motivation around how can you package all this together to achieve the goals you are wanting to achieve, rather than here's the answer, just do it like this, it'll be awesome. And posing some of those questions, I think, like, what are some of those fundamental things around how you're going to, the human teacher stuff again, I guess, that I keep coming back to. How are you going to use the space? Are they our kids? Are they my kids, my kids, my kids? Are we breaking out or breaking into edge spaces? You know, those dichotomous decisions that you need to make about how you're going to use things, that someone asking you those things because you haven't even thought about it. You didn't realize you needed to answer some of those things. So I would hope that we've started to get some understanding of those things and got it sort of codified a bit more. And I think that's what Grow Waitāha is trying to do. That's what our education brief process is trying to do. But have that a bit more nailed as a system so we understand where it's going, how it's working, what some of those things look like, I guess, for me.
Yeah. What about you, Michaela? What's the thing you would like to be able to say in 5 years' time that you achieved?
In 5 years, I feel like I'm on a beauty pageant. In 5 years' time, I would put the learner at the centre. So that's number one, and the ministry guideline thing is value as the learner at the centre. So in 5 years' time, you'd hope that each child could enter their space in an equally accessible way, and to bring their culture and their family values and what makes them special with them into the school, and they'd feel connected to that space, that their potential would be unlocked no matter where they sit on the spectrum, and that the learning space enhances their learning and caters for their learning rather than it being a barrier, or that they would hopefully it should be barrier free. Yeah.
That's really nice. And they're still very big statements, aren't they, what you just said? And if you want to be really specific, and here I am being the supervisor of a high degree student, you're talking there about your big goals, and they're lovely words, but the reality is in 5 years' time, what would be the thing that actually you would say, yeah, here is something that indicates we're heading that direction? And you did actually use a lovely term. You said that students walk into spaces and the spaces enhance their experience. Even that's fairly broad, isn't it? But even so, yeah, that's a really nice thing there. But I think one of the reasons why this is a nice little exercise is because we do fall into danger of the big glossy goals, and we lose sight. To get there, we have to actually have steps. And I chose 5 years because, yeah, it's a manageable set of steps, I think. Sorry, Michaela. Yep.
You would hope that there wouldn't be in 5 years' time, if you want to measure it, if all that's going well, it would be measurable in terms of no disparity between different ethnicities or between students with gender diversity and so on. And you would hope that the student achievement in core subjects would actually improve. I would hope. Like, I'm worried about the achievement levels in New Zealand. They seem to be dropping, or they are dropping away. And I get nervous that people will blame the space for that. And it could be, how do we know? How do we know if the space is contributing to it or not? I mean, we haven't got that data.
Yeah, we don't have that data. It's true. What about you, Rachel? What's your next 5-year goal?
I would really want to see innovative learning environments. And I mean that in the not just space, but kind of that whole experiential element. They're meeting these kind of deeper learning goals. I want all of that to really be valued and sought after and not just felt as if it's a trend. I think some people think it is just still a trend, and that is why they don't invest money and time to shift. And so achieving this would be having more widespread understanding that to really reach their goals, they need to work. It requires work and intentionality and breaking through some of these systemic barriers. And with that, I'd agree, Michaela, of having just kind of more fine tuning on our spaces in response to really understanding how students of different needs navigate them. If we're able to answer that. And then also clearly answer the safety message. That's a bigger deal in the States than it is elsewhere, but you know, guns and glass, people get real on. So if we could move past that within the next 5 years, that'd be great.
Yes. And I do have to say, Rachel, I love hearing the little gurgles of the future learners sitting on your knee, future users of these spaces. I think we should wrap it up there. The whole idea of the cafes is it gives us just a, 20, 30, 40 an hour, just a few people with some thoughts to get together and to throw things around. And I think we've done that really well here. It has been a sort of a future focused sort of set of thinking. And probably I'd finish off by saying I love the comments you make about what's in the future. Greg, you said about making sense of things. And I suppose my take on the talk today and the way I see things going over the next 5 years is we'll get to the stage where it's not us saying, how do I make sense of things? It will be us talking about how do our kids make sense of this things. And Michaela, you talk about spaces that enhance experience. You talk about a few things actually, all really good. I picked this one out. Spaces that enhance experiences. And again, I think in 5 years' time, if the conversation can be about kids themselves saying, how do these spaces enhance my experience, is the goal. And Rachel, you do come from a different position in that ILEs aren't anywhere near as established in the US, but you do also have pockets of extraordinarily good development over there. So I love that idea that ILEs over for you in the United States will become a trend and not just something, it become sought after. People actually want them. They won't just be a fad or that sort of perception, which I hope I'm not paraphrasing it too badly. And again, it's much the same. I think in 5 years' time in the US, if you've got kids saying, I want to be in one of those spaces, that they're the sorts of places I think I can learn best. I think that in 5 years' time, we're at that situation where we are focused on the kids more than just on teachers and on the design. I think we'll realise we've matured. We've gone a long way. Yeah, look, any other comments people want to make or?
Thank you for the opportunity. It's really great to discuss this with different people. And I think, Rachel, you're amazing to come on with the children and the husband and everything else.
But also Rachel's work is amazing. I'm lucky I know Rachel well through her PhD, and we visited and talked to the DLR people. It's quite a unique business. And they're in a totally different position to what we are in Australia and New Zealand. And I just had 5 weeks in Europe, and again, Sweden's in a different place, Scotland's in a different place, England's in a different space, Turkey's in a very different space. The whole idea of these conversations is to bridge barriers. So we're talking to the United States, New Zealand, and Australia in this little session. I'll run this again after the Northern Hemisphere summer's finished, and the same thing, and we'll get another bunch of ideas from that. But I'm steadfast in saying that actually our solutions, the 5-year solutions for me, come from an international perspective and a sort of global input and understanding of this, because we're all developing at different rates. And yes, the learning is very similar. I don't see a lot that's different in any of these sort of cultural centres. Look, we're on the cusp of something fantastic. We've got extraordinarily good designs coming through, and we're getting more and more of them. We're getting teachers who understand more and more that these spaces have potential. And to me, the next 5 years is going to be kids realising actually these are the spaces, that suit me, and I can choose. Actually, I'll end with one little anecdote. We did a quick master's project here, one of our students, on acoustics, and a new school had a big open space that we measured, and acoustically it was dreadful. It was absolutely horrible. Like, it was just off the charts in terms of poor reverberation and sound travel, etc., etc. But to unpack that a little bit, the student followed 3 kids with different types of hearing disorders and did a case study and really just tracked them for quite a long period of time working in these spaces. And one of her findings was that this space, regardless of the fact that acoustics were poor, which you think for kids with hearing disabilities, that's just a death knell, it would actually work for them, because what the students were doing, first of all, because the spaces were large, the students were finding those spaces actually where the acoustics were really good and suited their particular issue at the time. The second part was, because of the type of pedagogy that came with the open spaces, they could pick and choose the kids to work with. And the kids with these hearing disabilities were choosing kids who, for that particular task, that partner was the person who would help them the best. It's just a little anecdote of the way the kids themselves are using these spaces, and we know almost nothing about it. And to me, that's, you know, my goal is to get evidence about how these spaces are working across the myriad of different sort of variables. So yeah, we're all on a good journey and we're all doing different things. Love watching what Grow Harter is doing, and love having you in the project. Rachel, the same with DLR, quite different. It's good. We're off and running, and be marvellous. Look, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. And this was recorded, and we'll convert it and put it up onto the website so other people can listen to us. But we're sort of forming little subgroups through this project of people with common interest. And so feel free to run another one if you would like, and bring people like Rachel and people you don't necessarily know in on the conversation. Yeah. Anyway, Michaela, thank you. Thank you very much, Greg. Thank you, Rachel. And we shall see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you, everyone.